African Americans in the 1920s. So if you would, in your notebooks, please go ahead and record your answer to the entry question. Which figure, W.E.B. Du Bois or Booker T. Washington, was the better advocate for black people in the 1920s, and why? Record your answer in your notebook and then take a minute and share your answer with the person next to you. Make sure you explain why you've taken the position that you've taken. We're going to be learning about the Great Migration today, and we will be taking notes, so feel free to pause this video whenever you need to write down the information. Another advocate and founder of the NAACP was a woman named Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was featured in the movie Iron-Jawed Angels, which we watched a couple weeks ago. And Ida B. Wells was a black woman who comes into the shop basically saying, I want to help with women's suffrage, I want to participate in this parade, but you're making me march in the back, and I refuse to do that. And later when the parade happens, you see her come out and actually join the women and march in the front with all the other educated white women. Ida B. Wells was a muckraker. She opposed both W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, as well as some of the women's rights advocates. She opposed their philosophies. And she was much more radical than all of these groups. You saw her radicalism in the March on Washington, featured in Iron-Jawed Angels. She was also a founder of the NAACP. She's just an important figure to know. She was very radical, organized a lot of protests, advocated for freedom and equality right now, and was a huge supporter of black people. She also saw and was concerned about, in particular, black women, because many people are advocating for black men, and these sort of like upper middle class women are advocating for white women, and not a lot was being done to advocate for the black women. And so she's sort of the sojourner truth of the modern era. In the 1920s, we have something called the Great Migration, and you can see here the Great Migration has to do with African American people leaving the South. They're pictured here loading up everything they have, the whole family packed into a car and headed north. Blacks left the South in large numbers and tried to find work and freedom in the North. The lynching and other things that we learned about in Friday's lesson, in our last lesson, was getting pretty terrible, and so black people were looking for opportunities elsewhere. World War I had provided tons of industrial work for people in the United States domestically, producing war materials and processing things and shipping things so for the war. And so this was a great opportunity for black people to get jobs, and there were plenty of jobs for them in the North. 400,000 African Americans migrated from the South to the northern cities during this time. This lasted until about 1930, and this resulted in a major shift in where blacks lived in the United States. Before, black people primarily lived in the South, in the rural South, and black people are moving away from the farms where sharecropping is holding them back, and they are moving on and moving up to northern cities. And so some of the largest black populations in our country today are in places like New York City, Chicago, etc. In the 1920s, the KKK, also known as the Klu Klux Klan, was at its height. In 1925, the members planned a march on Washington, like many civil rights groups before them. Of course, the rights that they're advocating for are the rights of the ruling class to be able to suppress the lower class, basically believing that this country is founded by white, particularly Protestant white people, and that those people have a divine natural right to rule this land. So obviously, Klu Klux Klan is opposed to black people, but the Klu Klux Klan is a white supremacist group that also targeted non-Protestants. So Catholics, Jews, and other groups were targeted by the Klu Klux Klan. President Harding, who was president in the early 1920s, was possibly a member of the Klan, although some of the evidence is questionable. But he and President Harry Truman, who is president just at the end of World War II, are both suspected to have been members of the Klan. We do know that President Truman did pay the membership fee once, but his level of participation in the Klan is suspect. So. Point being, by mentioning both Harding and Truman, is that it was popular and okay at this point in history to be a member of the Klu Klux Klan, whereas today you would be labeled as a racist, and it's sort of not. You'd be labeled as somebody who is intolerant and perhaps a bigot if you announced your membership with the Klu Klux Klan. Many white people who were members of the Klu Klux Klan and otherwise were very concerned that the black people who had served in World War I, who were trained soldiers that were returning from war, would be aggressive, and this stirred up support for the KKK. And so even people who were not directly members of the KKK still had sort of anti-black sentiment and were nervous about these new trained black people. Also, white people coming back from World War I who had just fought and served and were trying to come back to claim their jobs found that a lot of their jobs were occupied by black people who had been serving them in their doing those jobs in their absence. So there was some sort of natural economic tension between white and black people, and then some perhaps unnecessary fear of black people based on the fact that they were trained soldiers and white people were accustomed and preferred that black people did not know how to use weapons so that they could continue to suppress and oppress them. So now we're going to watch a 4-minute film on the Great Migration. This is a film from PBS, I believe, and it's just about the Great Migration and its impact on black people in America.
Why does the Negro leave the South? Indeed, you would feel a large part of the answer if you could be on this train, in this Jim Crow car, and share for one night the longing of these people to reach the line that divides Dixie from the rest of creation.
As soon as I got on that train, I felt free. Sure, I was sitting in the Jim Crow section up front where all the coal and dust rose up, got in the windows and ruined my clothes. But the chugging of the train couldn't hardly keep up with the beating of my heart.
Just behind us is a car for white people, where they can stretch out and rest their heads. They have paid exactly the same fares as we have. Some of these colored men are in the service of the United States, summoned from the far corners of Texas to fight for democracy in Europe. This is certainly a good preparation for trench warfare.
We were hoping we'd see the Mason-Dixon line. I thought it would look like a line of trees with some kind of white mark in the middle. Then someone said the bridge ahead was it. We were north now.
In Chicago, there were no signs that said color folks on one side, white folks on the other. When we got off the train, everybody went through the same door to the same waiting room. There was no sneaking in the back way to Chicago. The station was beautiful, but noisy and frightening too. Either you found someone you knew, or you went to one of the organizations that helped settle newcomers. Right near the station was the Loop, Chicago's white business district. And if you went east, it was all Lake Michigan, so huge it could be an ocean.
It was strange to pause before a crowded newsstand and buy a newspaper without having to wait until a white man was served. And yet, because everything was so new, I began to grow tense again. I knew that this machine city was governed by strange laws, and I wondered if I would ever learn them. Richard Wright.
Dear Mama, when I got on the streetcar and saw colored people sitting by white people, I just held my breath. I thought any minute now they would start something. Nobody noticed. Now, you know I'm not crazy about mixing with white folks, but if I have to pay the same fare, I want the same accommodations. This is a real place for Negroes. I miss you terribly, Willa.
To my dear friend, if I had the money, I'd go back south and dig up my father's and mother's bones and bring them up to this country. I am 45 years old, and these 6 weeks I have spent here are the first weeks in my life of peace and comfort. And if I can't get along here, I mean to keep on going. But no matter what, I'll never go back.
You can see from this video that there was a great deal of excitement for African American people coming from the South, and so the Great Migration was a super exciting thing for many black people. So in the 1920s, we have something known as the Chicago Race Riots. Some of the tension that we see between the white people and the black people coming back from World War I, and when you have this many people moving north into cities that were predominantly white, black people are going to take the brunt of the blame for different situations. So we have a race riots activity for you to do, and basically the question is what caused the race riots, and who is at fault for these race riots? What really happened in Chicago? Do your best to answer the questions, and we'll turn them in tomorrow.